The crack of rifle fire echoed through the dense jungle near Lime, Bataan, on January 18, 1942. Sergeant Miguel Santos crouched behind a fallen mahogany tree, his Springfield 1903 rifle pressed firmly against his shoulder. Through the oppressive humidity that made the air feel like breathing through wet cloth, he watched Japanese infantry advancing in coordinated waves nearly 400 yards across the valley. The 43rd Infantry Regiment Philippine Scouts had been holding this defensive line for 6 days, and exhaustion showed on every face around him. Miguel was 28 years old, though the past month of continuous combat had aged him considerably. Born in Manila to a family with deep roots in the firearms trade, his father had operated a small armory near Intramuros, serving both civilian hunters and military personnel. From age 8, Miguel had spent afternoons in that workshop, watching his father disassemble, repair, and modify weapons with the skill passed down through 3 generations. The old man had taught him something crucial that no military manual ever covered. Tropical conditions destroyed weapons in ways that temperate climate engineers never anticipated. The Philippine Scouts represented the elite of General MacArthur's forces in the Far East. Organized in 1901, these Filipino soldiers serving under American commissioned officers had spent decades mastering jungle warfare, counterinsurgency operations, and the unique challenges of fighting in the Philippine archipelago. At 07:15 on December 8, 1941, when Japanese bombers struck Clark Field, Philippine Scout regiments became the first United States Army units engaged in ground combat during World War II. Now 6 weeks into the campaign, they formed the backbone of the desperate defense of Bataan. Miguel's commanding officer, Captain Robert Henderson, moved along the defensive position with his radio man close behind. The captain was 34, a West Point graduate who had initially viewed the Scouts with the casual dismissal common among mainland American officers. That attitude had evaporated during the first week of combat, when Scout units repeatedly outperformed expectations, while Philippine Army divisions, undertrained and poorly equipped, crumbled under Japanese assault. "Santos, how many rounds you got left?" Henderson called out, ducking instinctively as a Japanese mortar round impacted 60 yards to their left. "About 40, sir," Miguel replied, not taking his eye from his rifle sight. "But half are compromised." "Corrosion in the casings, powder probably degraded from the humidity." Henderson grimaced. Ammunition shortages plagued the entire Bataan defense. General MacArthur had ordered half rations in early January when it became clear that no reinforcements were coming, that the U.S. Navy lay crippled at Pearl Harbor, and that the Japanese naval blockade was absolute. But the ammunition situation was even more dire than the food shortage. And worse than simple scarcity was the rapid deterioration of munitions in tropical conditions that peacetime logistics officers had never properly anticipated. "Make them count," Henderson ordered needlessly before moving on. Miguel squeezed off a careful shot, watching a Japanese soldier 380 yards away drop his mortar round and collapse. He worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, and immediately noticed the telltale green tinge of corrosion on the brass. The next round he chambered showed worse degradation. He'd seen 3 rifles malfunction catastrophically in the past week, when compromised ammunition generated excessive chamber pressure. 2 of those Marines had lost fingers. 1 had lost half his face. The Japanese attack intensified at noon. Under the cover of mortar and machine gun fire, enemy infantry pushed closer to the scout positions. Miguel methodically engaged targets, but his rifle's accuracy was degrading with each shot. The barrel was fouling faster than normal, the bolt was sticking slightly on extraction, and he could feel unusual heat building in the receiver. These were the symptoms he'd seen countless times in his father's shop. Tropical warfare destroying weapons designed for European battlefields. At 14:08, disaster struck. Private Tommy Reyes, positioned 20 feet to Miguel's left, fired his Springfield, and the bolt assembly exploded backward, driving metal fragments into his face and shoulder. His screams brought the medic running while blood poured from a dozen lacerations. Miguel was at his side in seconds, applying pressure to the worst wounds while the medic worked. "Ammunition failure," Miguel told the medic grimly. "Corroded casing, excessive pressure. The bolt couldn't handle it." Captain Henderson appeared, surveying the wounded man with a hard expression. "Third one this week." "Santos, you worked in an armory before the war, didn't you?" "My family ran one for 3 generations, sir," Miguel confirmed. "We serviced hunting rifles for interior operations. The environment out here destroys weapons if you don't account for it properly." "Can you do anything about it?" Henderson's question wasn't quite an order, but the desperation behind it was clear. Miguel hesitated. What he was thinking violated every regulation in the Army manual. Modifying government weapons was grounds for court-martial. Using non-issued materials was forbidden. But watching Reyes bleeding into the jungle soil while Japanese forces prepared for another assault made the decision easier than it should have been. "Maybe, sir, but I'd need time and materials the Army doesn't issue." Henderson stared at him for a long moment. Around them, rifle fire continued its irregular percussion. "Figure it out, Sergeant. We can't keep fighting if our weapons keep exploding." That night, after the Japanese withdrew to regroup, Miguel began his experiment. Using materials scavenged from the jungle and abandoned Filipino villages, he started addressing the fundamental problem. Springfield rifles were magnificent weapons for temperate climates, but mechanically unsuited for sustained tropical operations. The bolt assembly, in particular, suffered from thermal expansion in extreme heat combined with humidity-driven corrosion. When compromised ammunition added excessive chamber pressure, catastrophic failure became inevitable. From a destroyed village near their position, Miguel recovered sections of bamboo. But not just any bamboo, he specifically sought kagingkingan, a variety prized by traditional Filipino builders for its exceptional humidity resistance and structural integrity. His grandfather had taught him to identify it by the distinctive node spacing and the slight golden tint to the inner fibers. In his father's shop, they'd used kagingkingan for custom rifle stocks when wealthy hunters requested weapons capable of withstanding monsoon season expeditions into the interior mountains. The second component took longer to find. He needed almasiga resin, derived from the almasiga tree that grew throughout Luzon's forests. Filipino shipbuilders had used this resin for centuries to waterproof vessels, and Miguel's father had experimented with it as a bore treatment for rifles used in coastal environments. Fortunately, Sergeant Carlos Mendoza, a scout from Zambales province, knew where several almasiga trees grew within their defensive perimeter. At 0237, Miguel and Mendoza made their way carefully through the scout positions, moving toward the tree line. Sentries challenged them twice, and both times Miguel explained they were gathering field-expedient maintenance materials. The almasiga tree stood 60 feet tall, its distinctive aromatic resin visible as crystallized deposits on the bark. Using his combat knife, Miguel carefully harvested several ounces of the clear resin, scraping it into an empty ration tin. Back at his position, Miguel worked by the dim light of a shielded candle. First, he treated the bamboo sections with controlled heat from the candle flame, a technique his father had taught him that drove out excess moisture and hardened the cellular structure. The smell was distinctive, sweet, and slightly sharp. Then he shaved the treated bamboo into precise thin strips using his knife, each one approximately 1.5 millimeters thick and cut to exact lengths that would fit inside the bolt housing of his Springfield. The almasiga resin required more complex preparation. He melted it slowly over the candle, mixing in tiny amounts of gun oil to create a compound that would remain slightly elastic after hardening. This was critical. The bamboo strips would absorb humidity and provide structural compensation for thermal expansion, but they needed a bonding agent that wouldn't become brittle or crack under the repeated thermal cycling of sustained fire. The final component proved most difficult to source. Miguel needed copper, specifically thin sheets that could be worked into precise shapes. After considerable thought, he retrieved 4 Philippine peso coins from his personal effects. Pre-war currency minted before 1937 contained sufficient copper content for his purposes. Using a rock as an anvil and the pommel of his combat knife as a hammer, he carefully flattened the coins into thin sheets, working as quietly as possible to avoid drawing attention. At 0415, Private First Class David Chen approached Miguel's position. Chen was 22, Chinese-Filipino from Binondo, and served as Henderson's communications specialist. "Sarge, what are you doing? That smells like my grandmother's furniture treatment. Fixing a problem the Army doesn't know how to solve," Miguel replied without looking up. He was carefully shaping the flattened copper coins into small sleeves that would fit around the bolt-locking lugs. Chen watched in fascination as Miguel began the final assembly. First, the treated bamboo strips were coated with the prepared Almaciga resin compound. Then, working with jeweler's precision using only his knife tip and fingers, Miguel inserted the strips into the bolt housing of his Springfield, positioning them in the narrow gaps between the bolt body and the receiver walls. The copper sleeves went onto the locking lugs themselves, providing a thermal buffer. The entire process took 90 minutes of painstaking work. "Will that actually work?" Chen asked skeptically. "We'll find out tomorrow," Miguel said, carefully reassembling his rifle. "The bamboo absorbs humidity that would otherwise corrode the bolt mechanism. The Almaciga resin creates a moisture barrier while providing slight shock absorption, and the copper sleeves compensate for thermal expansion in the locking lugs. In theory, this should prevent the bolt failures we've been seeing." "In theory," Chen repeated, "and if Captain Henderson finds out you modified your weapon?" "Then I face court-martial," Miguel said simply, "but that assumes we survive long enough for there to be a court-martial." At 0642, the Japanese launched their next assault. Miguel took his position behind the mahogany log, his modified Springfield feeling subtly different in his hands. The weight distribution had changed infinitesimally, and there was a barely perceptible difference in how the bolts cycled. He took aim at a Japanese officer, directing troops from a covered position 420 yards distant, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired smoothly, with less felt recoil than he'd experienced in days. The bolt extraction was effortless, none of the sticking he'd grown accustomed to. He chambered another round and fired again, then again. After 15 shots in rapid succession, he paused to check the weapon. The barrel was warm but not excessively hot. The bolt showed no signs of unusual stress. And most remarkably, the rifle's accuracy remained consistent rather than degrading as moisture and heat built up in the action. Captain Henderson noticed the difference. "Santos, your weapon seems to be functioning better than anyone else's. What did you do?" Miguel met his commanding officer's eyes. "Found a solution to the tropical maintenance problem, sir." Henderson stared at the rifle, then at Miguel. Around them, other scouts struggled with bulky weapons, brass casings sticking in overheated chambers, bolts requiring forceful manipulation to cycle. He could see the evidence of what Miguel had accomplished, even if he didn't yet understand the method. "Show me tonight," Henderson ordered. "And Santos, if this works, you'll be teaching every scout in the regiment." Regulations be damned. The day's fighting raged until 1745, when the Japanese withdrew once again. Scout casualties had been lighter than previous engagements, partly due to better defensive positioning, but also because fewer weapons had malfunctioned at critical moments. Miguel's rifle had fired 63 rounds without a single failure, an almost miraculous performance given the conditions and ammunition quality. That night, Captain Henderson summoned Miguel to his command post, a reinforced dugout 40 yards behind the front line. Also present were Lieutenant Richard Voss, the battalion operations officer, and Sergeant Major Patrick O'Brien, a 20-year Army veteran who'd served with the Scouts since 1925. "Explain what you did," Henderson ordered without preamble. Miguel detailed his modifications, explaining the properties of Kagingkingan bamboo, the moisture-resistant qualities of Almaciga resin, and the thermal compensation provided by the copper sleeves. He outlined the traditional Filipino knowledge that informed his approach, techniques developed over centuries of tropical living that military quartermasters in temperate climates had never considered. Sergeant Major O'Brien picked up Miguel's rifle, examining it closely. "I've been in the Philippine Department for 17 years, he said slowly. "Never occurred to me that local materials might solve problems we've been having with issued equipment. How long did it take you to develop this?" "About 20 years, Sergeant Major," Miguel replied honestly. "My father taught me most of it. I just adapted his gunsmithing techniques for military applications." Lieutenant Voss looked troubled. "Sir, regulations are explicit about modifications to issued weapons. If Division finds out, there could be serious consequences." Henderson's response was immediate. "Division is preparing to surrender Bataan within the next 2 months, unless a miracle occurs, Lieutenant. I'm more concerned about keeping my scouts combat effective than I am about equipment modification regulations." He turned to Miguel. "How many rifles can you modify with the materials you have access to?" "Within our defensive perimeter. Maybe a dozen, sir. But if I teach the technique to others, we could potentially modify every scout rifle in the regiment within a week." "Do it," Henderson ordered. "O'Brien, assign Santos 3 men to assist. Voss, you're to make no official record of this, understood?" "Yes, sir," Voss replied, though his expression suggested he was mentally composing the report he'd never write. Over the following 3 weeks, Miguel trained 12 scout sergeants in his modification technique. They worked at night, scavenging materials from the jungle and abandoned settlements. The Kaging-Kingan bamboo proved relatively abundant, the Almachiga trees less so, requiring increasingly long foraging expeditions. The copper presented the greatest challenge until someone discovered a destroyed Filipino artillery position containing brass shell casings that could be worked into suitable shapes. By February 9th, 117 scout rifles in the 43rd Regiment had been modified. Weapon malfunction rates dropped by 73%. More significantly, scout marksmanship improved dramatically as rifles maintained consistent accuracy despite the relentless tropical conditions. Japanese commanders noted in captured documents that the scout positions on the Limay line were inflicting disproportionate casualties compared to other sectors. But the larger situation on Bataan continued deteriorating. Food supplies dwindled to starvation levels. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever ravaged the defenders. The Japanese tightened their grip incrementally, and everyone knew that surrender was inevitable unless the reinforcements Roosevelt had promised actually materialized. At 08:23 on April 3, 1942, the Japanese launched their final offensive against Bataan. The assault was overwhelming, supported by artillery concentrations that pulverized defensive positions and aerial bombardment that came in relentless waves. The scout positions held longer than most, but by April 8th, organized resistance was collapsing. Captain Henderson assembled his surviving scouts at 2100 hours on April 8th. There were 67 men left from the company that had numbered 180 in January. "Orders have come down," Henderson said quietly. "General King is surrendering all forces on Bataan tomorrow morning. We're to destroy our weapons and prepare for captivity." The silence that followed was crushing. Miguel looked at his modified Springfield, the weapon that had kept him alive through 3 months of hell. Around him, other scouts stared at rifles they'd lovingly maintained, modified, and depended upon. "Some of you won't be surrendering," Henderson continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some will choose to disappear into the jungle, join the guerrilla bands that are forming. I can't order you to do that, and I can't officially condone it. But if men should happen to slip away before dawn with their weapons, I will report them as killed in action, rather than missing." Miguel made his decision in that moment. He'd spent 3 months solving problems with ingenuity and traditional knowledge. He wasn't about to become a prisoner while there was still a war to fight. At 02:15 on April 9, 1942, Sergeant Miguel Santos disappeared into the Philippine jungle, carrying his modified Springfield and 3 days' worth of rice. Behind him, 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers prepared for surrender and the horror of the Bataan Death March. Ahead lay 2.5 years of guerrilla warfare, survival against impossible odds, and the continued refinement of the innovations that would eventually change military sniping forever. The rain fell in sheets across Ormoc Valley on October 28, 1944, turning the narrow mountain trails into rivers of mud. Sergeant Miguel Santos moved through the downpour with practiced silence, his modified Springfield wrapped in oiled canvas to protect it from the relentless moisture. Behind him, 3 other Filipino guerrillas followed in single file, each man placing his feet exactly where Miguel had stepped. They'd been tracking this Japanese patrol for 6 hours, waiting for the right moment to strike. Miguel was still 28 years old, though the 2.5 years since his escape from Bataan had transformed him in ways that went beyond physical appearance. The guerrilla war in the mountains of Leyte had been brutal, fought with scavenged weapons, minimal supplies, and the constant knowledge that capture meant torture and execution. But it had also allowed him to refine his rifle modifications, testing them under conditions no peacetime armorer could have imagined. The war had turned decisively in favor of the Americans. On October 20th, General MacArthur had fulfilled his promise, returning to the Philippines with the Sixth Army landing at Leyte Gulf. Miguel had watched from the mountains as the invasion fleet, hundreds of ships stretching to the horizon, had delivered nearly 200,000 troops to the beaches. The sight had brought tears to his eyes, the first he'd shed since Bataan. 3 days after the landings, American patrols pushing inland had made contact with guerrilla units. Miguel's group, part of Colonel Ruperto Canglian's organized resistance network, had spent those days providing intelligence on Japanese positions and guiding American units through terrain their maps couldn't adequately describe. It was during one of these liaison missions that Miguel encountered men from the reconstituted Philippine Scouts. The 43rd Infantry Regiment Philippine Scouts had been rebuilt from survivors who'd escaped Bataan, former guerrillas, and new recruits trained in Australia and New Guinea. When Miguel presented himself at their headquarters near Palo on October 25th, wearing the remnants of his pre-war uniform and carrying his battered Springfield, the reaction had been immediate. Lieutenant David Morrison was 31, a lean officer from Iowa who'd served with the 32nd Infantry Division in New Guinea before being assigned to the reconstituted Scouts. He'd heard the stories about pre-war scout capabilities, but remained skeptical that guerrillas, no matter how motivated, could match properly trained soldiers. His attitude changed when he examined Miguel's service record. "Says here you were with Henderson's company on Bataan," Morrison said, studying the paperwork Miguel had somehow preserved through years in the jungle. "Captain Robert Henderson?" "Yes, sir. He was my commanding officer until the surrender. Henderson made it out on a submarine in early 1943. He's back stateside now, training new scout battalions." Morrison looked up. He submitted a report about weapon modifications developed on Bataan, something about using local materials to improve tropical performance. "You know anything about that?" Miguel hesitated. The modifications had been technically illegal, violations of Army regulations that could still result in disciplinary action. But the war had changed, and surely after 2 years of guerrilla operations such concerns were irrelevant. "I developed those modifications, sir. Captain Henderson authorized field testing when standard equipment kept failing in tropical conditions." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "You're the one? There's been considerable interest in those techniques. Ordnance officers have been trying to replicate the results with limited success." He gestured to Miguel's rifle. "Is that weapon still using the modifications?" "Enhanced versions, sir. I've had 2.5 years to refine the system." "Show me," Morrison ordered, clearing his desk. Miguel unwrapped his Springfield and proceeded to disassemble it with the fluid precision of someone who'd performed the task thousands of times. As he removed the bolt assembly, Morrison leaned forward, studying the interior of the bolt housing. What he saw made him reach for his reading glasses to examine more closely. The bamboo components had evolved considerably from Miguel's original Bataan design. Instead of simple strips, he'd developed a complex lattice system using 3 different bamboo varieties, each chosen for specific properties. Kagingkingan still formed the primary humidity absorption layer, but he'd added thin sections of Kawayan Tinik for its superior strength and bulus for thermal regulation. The almasiga resin compound had been refined with the addition of pine pitch and a trace amount of kapok oil, creating a substance that remained flexible across a wider temperature range. Most impressive were the copper components. Miguel had fabricated precision sleeves for each locking lug, using copper recovered from destroyed Japanese equipment. These weren't crude hammered coins anymore, but carefully shaped pieces that fit with jewelers' tolerances. He'd even created a thermal compensation system for the firing pin, using a tiny spring made from scavenged piano wire. "This is remarkable craftsmanship," Morrison admitted, "but it's also a clear violation of regulations against modifying issued weapons, especially using non-standard materials that haven't been tested by Army ordnance. Sir, I've fired approximately 4,000 rounds through this weapon over the past 2 years, in conditions ranging from typhoons to 100-degree heat, with 98% humidity. It's never malfunctioned once." Morrison picked up the bolt assembly, feeling its weight, studying how the components fit together. Regulations exist for good reasons, Sergeant. Standardization ensures reliability. When we allow individual modifications, we create maintenance nightmares and potential safety hazards. Respectfully, sir. Standard doctrine also said scout rifles couldn't maintain accuracy beyond 500 yards in tropical conditions. This weapon has made confirmed kills at over 700 yards during monsoon season. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain James Fletcher, Morrison's battalion commander. Fletcher was 38, a career officer who'd served in the Philippine department before the war and had managed to escape to Australia before the Bataan surrender. He'd heard Miguel's name mentioned and came to investigate. "Sergeant Santos, I heard you'd turned up. I served with the 31st Infantry before the war. Some of the scout sergeants there talked about the weapon modifications you developed." Fletcher noticed the disassembled rifle on Morrison's desk. "Still using that system?" "Yes, sir." Fletcher picked up one of the bamboo lattice components, examining it in the light. "I read Henderson's report when I was in Australia. He claimed your modifications reduced malfunction rates by over 70%. Ordnance dismissed it as anecdotal evidence from extreme circumstances. The circumstances on Bataan were extreme, sir, but the physics behind the modifications are sound. Tropical conditions create specific mechanical stresses that standard Springfield designs can't handle. The bamboo system compensates for those stresses by violating every regulation in the maintenance manual," Morrison interjected. "Lieutenant Morrison raises a valid point," Fletcher said. "However, we're about to push into Ormoc Valley against heavy Japanese resistance. If Sergeant Santos's modifications could give our snipers an edge in these conditions, I'm inclined to field test them, despite regulatory concerns." Morrison's expression suggested he disagreed, but recognized when a decision had been made above his level. "Sir, if we authorize these modifications and something goes wrong, there will be serious questions from division." "Then we won't formally authorize them," Fletcher replied. "Santos, you'll be attached to Lieutenant Morrison's rifle company as a designated marksman. Your weapon is your responsibility, but you will demonstrate its capabilities to our scout snipers. If they choose to adopt similar modifications on their own initiative, that's their decision, as individual soldiers maintaining their equipment." The legal fiction was transparent, but it allowed everyone to avoid the appearance of officially sanctioning regulation violations. Miguel understood the game and accepted it. "Yes, sir, when do we move out?" "Dawn tomorrow. We're supporting the advance by the 24th Infantry Division toward Ormoc City. Intelligence reports Japanese forces are setting up defensive positions in the valley, using the monsoon weather to limit our air support and artillery effectiveness." At 05:30 the next morning, Morrison's company moved out from their base near Dagami, heading west toward the central mountain range that separated Leyte Valley from Ormoc Valley. The conditions were exactly as bad as predicted. Rain fell continuously, turning roads into quagmires and reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. The temperature was 34 degrees Celsius, and humidity approached 100%. Miguel moved with 2nd Platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Richard Voss, a 24-year-old officer from Oregon making his first combat deployment. Voss had been briefed on Miguel's background, but remained skeptical about the effectiveness of improvised weapon modifications. "The technical manuals are written by engineers with advanced degrees," Voss commented, as they slogged through ankle-deep mud. "No offense, Sergeant, but I doubt local materials can outperform properly designed military equipment." "None taken, sir. I hope you're right and standard equipment works perfectly, but if it doesn't, I'll be ready." By 09:15, they'd reached the foothills and began ascending into the mountains. The jungle grew thicker, the trails steeper, and the rain heavier. Miguel noticed other soldiers struggling with their weapons, constantly checking actions for mud intrusion and wiping moisture from metal surfaces. His own rifle, protected by its oiled canvas wrap, remained dry despite the conditions. At 11:45, the column halted for a scheduled break. Voss ordered weapons maintenance, and Miguel watched as scout riflemen disassembled their Springfields to clean and dry components. Corporal James Wu, a Chinese Filipino from Manila, was having particular difficulty with his bolt assembly. "Damn thing keeps sticking," Wu muttered, working the action repeatedly. "Feels like there's grit in the locking lugs, but I've cleaned it 3 times already." Miguel knelt beside him. It's not grit, it's thermal expansion from the heat, combined with moisture swelling in the wood of your stock. The metal components are expanding at different rates, causing binding in the bolt housing. Wu looked skeptical. If that's the problem, how come your weapon isn't having the same issue? Because I've modified mine to compensate for tropical conditions. Miguel briefly explained the bamboo and resin system, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing Lieutenant Voss's attention. Can you modify mine? Wu asked immediately. Not without materials I don't have with me, but when we get back to base I can show you how. The conversation was cut short by the crack of rifle fire from the head of the column. Japanese forces had established an ambush position on the ridgeline above, using the weather to conceal their preparations. Bullets snapped through the jungle canopy as scouts scrambled for cover. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. Second platoon, Japanese machine gun position, grid reference 234567, approximately 600 yards up the slope. Suppressive fire. Voss relayed the order and his riflemen began returning fire. But the conditions made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Rain obscured vision, moisture fouled rifle actions, and the extreme range tested the limits of standard equipment. Miguel watched as Corporal Wu's rifle jammed after 3 shots, the bolt refusing to extract a spent casing swollen by humidity. "Santos, can you engage that position?" Voss shouted over the gunfire. Miguel unwrapped his Springfield and moved to a position behind a fallen log that offered a clear field of fire up the slope. Through the rain, he could barely make out the Japanese machine gun nest, a darker shadow against the jungle green, approximately 620 yards distant. Standard doctrine said this shot was impossible in these conditions. The rain alone should have made precision fire impractical. He made rapid calculations, compensating for the reduced visibility, the effect of rain on bullet trajectory, and the elevated target angle. Then he settled his breathing, found his natural respiratory pause, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle functioned flawlessly despite the moisture. Through his scope, Miguel saw the Japanese machine gunner slump forward. The gun fell silent for perhaps 10 seconds before another soldier moved to take over. Miguel fired again, and that man fell as well. After the third Japanese soldier died attempting to man the weapon, the position was abandoned. Lieutenant Voss stared at Miguel with an expression mixing disbelief and recalculation. "How did you make those shots? My men can barely see the target, much less hit it." "The modifications, sir. They keep the rifle functioning consistently regardless of environmental conditions." The ambush broken, Morrison ordered the advance to continue. But word of Miguel's shooting spread quickly through the company. By the time they established a defensive position for the night at 1830, 6 scout riflemen had approached Miguel asking about the modification system. That evening, as rain continued to pour down, Miguel sat under a makeshift shelter fashioned from a poncho and taught an impromptu class on tropical weapon maintenance. Corporal Wu, Private First Class David Chen, and 4 other scouts listened intently as he explained the principles behind his modifications. "The Army assumes weapons will be used in temperate conditions," Miguel explained, using a stick to draw diagrams in the mud. "But tropical environments create problems the engineers never anticipated. Humidity causes wood to swell and metal to corrode at accelerated rates. Extreme heat creates thermal expansion. And when you combine those factors with the mechanical stresses of rapid fire, you get catastrophic failures. So the bamboo absorbs the humidity that would otherwise affect the wood stock and metal components?" Chen asked. "Exactly. And the different bamboo varieties work together. Kaginkingan handles the moisture absorption, Kawayan Tinik provides structural strength, and Bulos regulates temperature. The resin compound binds them together, while remaining flexible enough to accommodate thermal cycling." Sergeant First Class Patrick O'Brien, a 42-year-old career scout who'd survived Bataan and the Death March before escaping from a prison camp, had been listening from nearby. "I saw the early version of this system on Bataan. It worked then, but this is much more sophisticated. How'd you develop it?" "Trial and error over 2 years in the jungle. Every time something failed, I figured out why and modified the design. I've probably gone through 30 different iterations before settling on this configuration." O'Brien picked up Miguel's rifle, examining it closely in the dim light of a shielded candle. "Lieutenant Morrison isn't going to like it if half the platoon starts modifying their weapons without authorization." "Which is why I'm not ordering anyone to do anything," Miguel replied carefully. "I'm just sharing information about techniques that work for me. What individual soldiers choose to do with that information is their decision." The legal fiction was thin, but it provided plausible deniability. Over the next 3 days, as Morrison's company continued operations in Ormoc Valley, Miguel quietly assisted 11 scout riflemen in modifying their weapons. They scavenged materials from the jungle during rest periods, worked on the modifications during night halts, and tested them during subsequent engagements. The results were undeniable. Malfunction rates dropped dramatically among the modified rifles. Accuracy remained consistent despite continued monsoon conditions, and most significantly, scout snipers began engaging Japanese positions at ranges that doctrine considered impractical. That 0722 on November 3rd, Morrison summoned Miguel to his command post. The lieutenant's expression was unreadable. "Captain Fletcher wants to see you at battalion headquarters. He didn't say why, but I suspect it concerns certain unauthorized weapon modifications that have been spreading through my company." Miguel reported to battalion headquarters at 0915, uncertain whether he was about to be commended or court-martialed. What he found was neither. Captain Fletcher sat behind a folding table with 2 other officers Miguel didn't recognize. One wore Navy insignia, the other had Ordnance Corps brass. "Sergeant Santos, this is Captain Richard Holloway from the Naval Armory at Subic Bay, and Lieutenant Colonel Frank Chen from Army Ordnance. They've traveled here specifically to speak with you about your weapon modifications." Miguel came to attention, his mind racing. Navy and Ordnance involvement suggested this went far beyond a local disciplinary matter. This was either very good or very bad. Captain Holloway spoke first. "At ease, Sergeant. We're not here to bring charges. We're here because Admiral Kincaid has ordered an investigation into reports of scout snipers, achieving kill ratios that shouldn't be possible with standard equipment. Your name keeps appearing in those reports." Intelligence reports arrived at battalion headquarters on November 7, 1944, identifying a Japanese sniper operating in the mountains east of San Jose, who'd killed 14 American soldiers over the previous 5 days. Radio intercepts suggested the sniper was someone special, someone the Japanese called Bayako no Shisha, the White Tiger's messenger. Field intelligence officers believed this was a propaganda designation, rather than an actual connection to the legendary White Tiger killed on Leyte months earlier. But the effect on American morale was real, and Division wanted the threat eliminated. Lieutenant David Morrison received the assignment at 0845 on November 8th. His company would conduct a sweep operation through the sector where the Japanese sniper operated, with specific orders to locate and neutralize the threat. Morrison immediately thought of Miguel Santos, whose reputation had grown considerably since the weapon modification investigation concluded 3 days earlier. The Navy and Ordnance officers had been surprisingly supportive after examining Miguel's rifle and testing it under controlled conditions. Captain Holloway's report acknowledged that the bamboo stabilization system represented genuine innovation worthy of further study, though he'd also noted that implementing it across the entire Pacific Theater would be logistically impractical. The compromise solution was typically military. Miguel's modifications were neither officially authorized nor officially prohibited. He could continue using his system, and other soldiers could adopt it at their own discretion, but the Army would not provide materials or formal training. Now Morrison needed Miguel's expertise for a different reason. "Sergeant Santos, report to my CP immediately," he radioed at 0920. Miguel arrived 15 minutes later, finding Morrison studying topographical maps spread across a folding table. Lieutenant Richard Voss was also present, along with Sergeant Patrick O'Brien and 2 other Scout NCOs Miguel recognized from previous operations. "Intelligence says we have a Japanese sniper problem," Morrison began without preamble. "Someone who's been operating in this sector for at least a week, maybe longer. 14 confirmed kills, all at ranges exceeding 600 yards. He's hitting officers, radio men, and forward observers. Anyone whose death disrupts our operations." Miguel studied the map, noting the locations where casualties had occurred. The pattern suggested someone highly skilled and patient, someone who understood American tactical procedures well enough to anticipate high-value targets. That's sophisticated targeting, sir, not random opportunistic shooting. This person has training. Which is why I want you leading the counter-sniper operation, Morrison said. Take 3 men, find this bastard, and eliminate him. You have operational discretion on tactics and timing. What about the weather forecast, sir? We're expecting heavy storms starting tomorrow afternoon. Morrison's expression hardened. The Japanese sniper has been most effective during bad weather. He uses the conditions to mask his position and limit our ability to respond with artillery or air support. If storms are coming, that's probably when he'll strike again. Miguel nodded slowly, understanding the implications. Hunting an elite enemy sniper during a tropical storm meant operating under the worst possible conditions. Exactly the scenario where his rifle modifications provided their greatest advantage. I'll need Corporal Wu, Private Chen, and Sergeant O'Brien if you can spare them, sir. Granted. Draw 3 days' rations and as much ammunition as you need. Move out at 0600 tomorrow morning. The 4-man team departed on November 9th under overcast skies that promised worsening conditions. Miguel had chosen his companions carefully. Corporal James Wu was 24, a skilled tracker who'd hunted with his father in the mountains of northern Luzon before the war. Private David Chen, 22, possessed exceptional eyesight and the patience necessary for sustained observation. Sergeant Patrick O'Brien, at 42, brought decades of scout experience and an intimate knowledge of Japanese tactical doctrine gained through years serving in the Philippines before the war. They moved through terrain that grew increasingly rugged as they pushed deeper into the mountains. The jungle was dense, visibility limited to 30 or 40 yards in most places, with occasional clearings where logging operations had cut swaths through the forest before the war. These clearings were dangerous, obvious kill zones where any movement could be observed from elevated positions. At 13:45, O'Brien spotted something that made him signal the team to halt. On a tree branch 80 yards ahead hung a small piece of cloth deliberately positioned to flutter in the breeze. That's a ranging marker, O'Brien said quietly. Japanese snipers use them to calculate distance. It means we're in his operating area. Miguel scanned the ridgelines above them, looking for any position that would offer commanding views of the valley below. The Japanese sniper would need elevation, concealment, and multiple egress routes. His eyes settled on a rock formation, approximately 900 yards to their northeast, partially obscured by vegetation, but offering clear fields of fire over several likely American approach routes. He's up there, Miguel said, pointing to the formation. Or was recently. That position controls everything. How do we get up there without him seeing us? Chen asked. We don't try during daylight. We wait until dark, move into position under cover of the storm, and be ready when he returns at dawn. They spent the afternoon reconnoitering alternate routes up the slope, identifying natural cover, and planning their approach. At 17:30, the rain began, starting as a light drizzle that rapidly intensified into a tropical downpour. Wind gusts shook the jungle canopy, and visibility dropped to near zero. Perfect conditions for movement. At 1900 hours, the team began their ascent. The rain made footing treacherous on the steep slope, but it also masked any sound their movement might generate. They climbed for 3 hours, gaining nearly 600 feet of elevation through terrain that would have been challenging in daylight and was nightmarish in darkness. Twice they paused when lightning illuminated their surroundings, afraid the momentary brightness might reveal them to any observer. At 22:15, they reached a position 150 yards from the rock formation Miguel had identified. O'Brien scouted ahead and returned 30 minutes later with confirmation. Fresh tracks, less than 6 hours old. Boot prints, Japanese issue. He's been using that position, probably will return at first light. They established a concealed observation point with clear lines of fire to the rock formation and settled in to wait. The rain continued without pause, accompanied by wind gusts exceeding 70 kilometers per hour. Temperature remained around 34 degrees Celsius, and humidity was absolute. These were conditions where standard military equipment failed, where rifles jammed, optics fogged, and even the most carefully maintained weapons became unreliable. Miguel unwrapped his Springfield and performed a detailed function check. Despite 6 hours exposed to the storm, the rifle's action operated smoothly. The bamboo system inside the bolt housing was doing exactly what he'd designed it to do, absorbing moisture, compensating for thermal stress, and maintaining mechanical integrity regardless of environmental conditions. At 05:47, dawn began to break, though heavy cloud cover and continuing rain meant visibility remained limited. Miguel watched the rock formation through his scope, looking for any sign of movement. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Then, at 06:12, he saw it, a barely perceptible shift in the vegetation screening one edge of the formation. "Contact," Miguel whispered, "northwest corner of the formation behind the ferns." Wu, serving as spotter, trained his binoculars on the location. "I see him. Wait, there's something wrong with that position." Miguel adjusted his scope, studying the area more carefully. Wu was right. The Japanese sniper had chosen a position that appeared tactically sound, but had a critical flaw. At this hour, with the wind direction shifting, the vegetation screening his hide would blow aside periodically, creating momentary windows of visibility. Either the sniper didn't realize this, or he was confident no one could make an accurate shot at this range in these conditions. "Range?" Miguel asked. 840 yards, Wu replied after consulting his handmade ranging cards. "Wind gusting between 60 and 80 kilometers per hour, direction variable, rain reducing visibility by approximately 70%, temperature 35 degrees, humidity 100%. These were calculations that no standard military rangefinder could provide, data that existed nowhere in official doctrine, but they were essential for making a shot that conventional wisdom said was impossible. Miguel began his mental calculations, compensating for the extreme conditions while waiting for the wind to create that crucial window of visibility. At 06:18, the wind shifted precisely as Miguel had anticipated. The ferns screening the Japanese position blew aside for perhaps 2 seconds. Through his scope, Miguel saw a man in a rain cape, his rifle pointed down into the valley below, waiting for American patrols that would arrive within the hour. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Miguel's breathing steadied, his trigger finger took up the slack, and the modified Springfield fired. The sound was instantly swallowed by wind and rain. Through the scope, Miguel saw the Japanese sniper pitch forward, his rifle falling from suddenly nerveless hands. The entire sequence, from target identification to shot, had taken less than 4 seconds. "Hit confirmed," Wu said, watching through his binoculars. "No movement. We need to verify the kill and search the body for intelligence." They approached the rock formation carefully, weapons ready in case the sniper had a spotter or backup nearby. But the position was solitary, occupied only by the dead man and his equipment. The Japanese sniper was older than Miguel expected, perhaps 38, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years in the field. His rifle was a Type 97 sniper variant, well-maintained and equipped with a scope of impressive quality. O'Brien searched the body, finding documents in a waterproof pouch. "Sir, you need to see this. According to these papers, this man was Sergeant Major Hiroshi Nakamura, formerly of the Japanese Olympic shooting team. Pre-war competition records show he placed 4th at the 1936 Berlin Games." The revelation explained the sniper's exceptional skills. This wasn't merely a trained military marksman, but an internationally competitive shooter who'd brought world-class abilities to the battlefield. His document pouch contained meticulous records, range cards for 7 different positions, detailed notes on American patrol patterns, and a tally of confirmed kills that matched intelligence estimates. 87 kills, Chen said quietly, reading the tally sheet. He kept score like it was still a sporting competition. They recovered Nakamura's rifle, documents, and personal effects for intelligence analysis, then began the descent back to American lines. The storm continued raging, but Miguel noticed something that wouldn't have registered before his years of jungle warfare. The rain was changing character, becoming less intense, but more sustained. This was the shift from convective storm to monsoon pattern, the kind of weather that could persist for days. At 14:30, they arrived back at Morrison's headquarters and reported mission success. The lieutenant examined Nakamura's documents with growing understanding. This explains a lot. An Olympic-level shooter with years of experience in the Philippines. No wonder he was so effective. He looked at Miguel. How did you make that shot? Range was over 800 yards in a tropical storm. That shouldn't be possible. The modifications, sir. They keep the rifle functioning when standard equipment fails. Captain Fletcher arrived as Miguel was completing his after-action report. Sergeant Santos, I've just been on the radio with Division Intelligence. They're extremely interested in the documents you recovered. Nakamura wasn't just any sniper. He was training a cadre of Japanese marksmen in specialized tropical warfare techniques. The kill you made today likely disrupted an entire enemy sniper program. Sir, I was just doing my job. Your job involved making an 840-yard shot through a tropical storm that meteorologists are now saying was producing winds up to 85 kilometers per hour with near-zero visibility, Fletcher replied. That's not just doing your job. That's demonstrating capabilities that need serious examination. Over the next 3 days, the story of Miguel's impossible shot spread through the division. Other units requested scout sniper support, specifically asking for personnel trained in the Santos method, as it had become unofficially known. Division operations officers began planning missions around the assumption that scout snipers could engage targets at ranges previously considered impractical, fundamentally changing tactical calculations. At 07:15 on November 12th, Morrison summoned Miguel again. Orders from Division: you're being temporarily detached to the Naval Armory at Subic Bay. They want to conduct comprehensive tests on your rifle and document your modification techniques. Captain Holloway specifically requested you. For how long, sir? As long as it takes. The war is changing, Santos. We're going to be island hopping all the way to Japan, fighting in tropical conditions the entire way. If your methods can give us an edge, the Navy wants it documented and distributed. Miguel reported to Subic Bay Naval Armory on November 15th, carrying his modified Springfield and several examples of unmodified rifles for comparison testing. The facility was larger than he expected, with multiple testing ranges, environmental chambers capable of simulating extreme conditions, and a staff of armorers and ballistics specialists. Captain Richard Holloway met him at the entrance, accompanied by Chief Petty Officer Frank Chen, his senior technical specialist. Chen was 36, Chinese-American from San Francisco, and possessed advanced degrees in mechanical engineering from Stanford. He'd been studying Miguel's rifle modifications since the initial examination 3 weeks earlier. Sergeant Santos, thank you for coming, Holloway began. Chief Chen has been trying to replicate your bamboo system with limited success. We'd like you to demonstrate the complete process from material selection through final assembly. For the next week, Miguel worked alongside Chen and 3 other naval armorers, teaching them everything he'd learned through years of trial and error. They took detailed notes, photographed each step, and tested multiple variations to understand which elements were essential and which could be modified. The testing phase revealed results that shocked the technical staff. In environmental chamber trials simulating extreme tropical conditions, Miguel's modified rifle maintained 94% accuracy at 800 yards, while standard Springfields degraded to less than 50% effectiveness. Reliability tests showed his rifle functioned through 500 consecutive shots without malfunction, while standard rifles averaged failures every 80 rounds under identical conditions. This is extraordinary, Chen admitted on the 6th day of testing. You've created a system that outperforms standard equipment by margins we wouldn't have thought possible, and you did it using materials that cost essentially nothing and can be sourced locally anywhere in the tropics. My father always said the best solutions work with your environment instead of against it, Miguel replied. The Army designs weapons for European warfare, then expects them to work everywhere. But the Philippines aren't Europe. The jungle has its own rules. At 16:45 on November 21st, Holloway called Miguel to his office for a final meeting. The captain's expression was complicated, mixing admiration with something that looked like regret. Sergeant, we've completed our analysis. Chief Chen's report confirms that your modifications represent a significant advancement in tropical weapons technology. However, implementing your system across the Pacific Theater presents problems we can't easily solve. Miguel listened as Captain Holloway explained the bureaucratic reality behind the technical success. It was February 22nd, 1945, and he'd spent the past 3 months at Subic Bay working with Navy armorers to document and refine his modification system. The results had exceeded everyone's expectations, but institutional inertia was proving harder to overcome than Japanese defenses. The problem isn't effectiveness, Holloway continued, spreading several technical reports across his desk. Chief Chen's data proves your system works. The problem is implementation. We'd need to train thousands of armorers in material identification, establish supply chains for bamboo and resin that don't exist, and convince field commanders to authorize modifications that violate standing regulations. The logistics are overwhelming. Chief Petty Officer Frank Chen sat beside Holloway, his expression frustrated. Chen had become a genuine advocate for Miguel's innovations after months of testing and analysis. Sir, with respect, we're talking about a system that increases combat effectiveness by 40% in tropical conditions. Shouldn't that override logistical concerns? In a rational world, yes, Holloway replied. But we don't operate in a rational world. We operate in a military bureaucracy where regulations exist for reasons that go beyond battlefield effectiveness. Standardization prevents chaos. When every unit modifies equipment differently, maintenance becomes impossible, and supply chains collapse. Miguel had heard variations of this argument before. It was the eternal tension between innovation and institutional control, between what worked in practice and what fit within established doctrine. Captain, what if we limited implementation? Train cadres in each division, let them modify weapons for specialist roles only. Sniper teams, reconnaissance units, forward observers. Personnel who operate independently and maintain their own equipment. Holloway considered this. That might be workable, keeps the modifications contained while still providing tactical benefits where they matter most. He turned to Chen. Could we develop a simplified training program? Something that could be taught in 2 or 3 days rather than weeks? Possibly, Chen replied. We've identified the critical components. If we focus on those and accept slightly reduced performance, we could streamline the process considerably. Over the next 2 weeks, they developed what became unofficially known as the Santos Modification Field Manual. It was never officially published, never formally authorized, and never distributed through normal supply channels. Instead, it circulated through informal networks, passed from scout to scout, copied by hand in quiet moments between operations. The manual explained material selection, preparation techniques, and assembly procedures in clear language that any competent soldier could follow. At 08:30 on March 8, 1945, Miguel received orders reassigning him to the 43rd Infantry Regiment Philippine Scouts for operations supporting the invasion of northern Luzon. The regiment was being committed to the Cagayan Valley campaign, where Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita had established formidable defensive positions in mountainous terrain. Intelligence estimated 50,000 Japanese troops were prepared to fight to the death rather than surrender. Miguel reported to regimental headquarters near San Fernando on March 12th, finding the unit had grown considerably since he'd last served with them. The regiment now included companies built around veterans who'd survived Bataan and the Death March, guerrillas who'd fought throughout the occupation, and fresh recruits trained in the United States. Captain James Fletcher, promoted to major and now serving as battalion executive officer, welcomed him personally. Santos, good to see you. I've been reading the reports from Subic Bay. Impressive work. Fletcher gestured to a map showing the Cagayan Valley. We're going up against prepared positions in some of the worst terrain in the Philippines. Japanese have had 3 years to fortify. They're using the monsoon season to their advantage, knowing our air support and artillery will be degraded by weather. Sound familiar? Very familiar, sir. It's exactly the conditions where modified weapons provide maximum advantage. Which is why I've authorized formation of a specialized scout sniper section. 12 men, all volunteers, all equipped with modified rifles. You'll train them, lead them, and demonstrate what's possible when we stop fighting according to someone else's rulebook. The sniper section assembled on March 15th. Miguel recognized several faces. Corporal James Wu had survived 2 years of additional combat and been promoted twice. Sergeant Patrick O'Brien, now 43, had refused retirement to remain with the Scouts. The other 9 men were a mix of pre-war Scouts, guerrilla veterans, and carefully selected recruits who demonstrated exceptional marksmanship and mechanical aptitude. For 2 weeks, Miguel trained them intensively. They learned to identify proper bamboo varieties by touch and sight, to prepare almasiga resin under field conditions, and to install the modification system with the precision necessary for reliable function. More importantly, they learned the ballistic calculations that made long-range shooting possible, compensating for humidity, accounting for elevation changes, reading wind in triple canopy jungle where traditional methods failed. Private First Class Ramon Cruz, a 19-year-old from Baguio who'd spent the occupation hunting in the Cordillera Mountains, mastered the techniques quickest. "My grandfather taught me similar methods for preparing bamboo hunting implements," he explained, "using natural materials that work with the environment instead of against it. The Army just applies the same principles to different purposes." By March 30th, all 12 snipers had successfully modified their rifles and demonstrated proficiency at ranges exceeding 700 yards in tropical conditions. Major Fletcher inspected their work, comparing the modified weapons to standard-issue Springfields side by side. "The external differences are minimal," Fletcher observed. "Unless someone disassembles the weapon and knows what to look for, the modifications are invisible. That provides useful, plausible deniability if ordnance starts asking questions." "That was intentional, sir," Miguel replied. "The more invisible the improvements, the less institutional resistance they generate." The regiment deployed into the Cagayan Valley on April 3rd, beginning a campaign that would last until the Japanese surrender in August. The terrain was everything intelligence had predicted: steep mountains covered in triple canopy jungle, narrow trails that became impassable during daily monsoons, and defensive positions so well concealed that American units often stumbled into them before realizing they were there. At 0647 on April 9th, exactly 3 years after the Bataan surrender, Miguel's sniper section received its first major assignment. A Japanese strongpoint on Hill 427 had stopped the regiment's advance for 3 days. The position commanded approaches from 3 directions, and attempts to flank it had resulted in heavy casualties. Artillery couldn't reach it due to the overhead canopy, and airstrikes were impossible during the continuous storms. Miguel studied the hill through his scope from a position 840 yards distant. The Japanese had constructed a masterpiece of defensive engineering, interconnected bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, camouflaged so expertly that even knowing approximately where they were, he could barely identify specific positions. Machine gun crews rotated positions regularly, making it difficult to target individuals. Mortar teams fired from covered pits, then immediately displaced before counter-battery fire could arrive. "Standard approach won't work," Sergeant O'Brien observed, lying beside Miguel with his binoculars. "They've thought through every conventional countermeasure. We need something they won't expect." Miguel had been thinking about exactly that problem. "They've prepared for direct assault, for flanking maneuvers, for artillery, but they haven't prepared for precision fire at extreme range during storms because they don't think that's possible." "It barely is possible," Wu interjected. "We're talking 800-plus yards through jungle in monsoon conditions. Even with the modifications, that's pushing limits." "Which is exactly why they won't expect it," Miguel replied. "We position the entire section at maximum effective range, identify high-value targets during lulls in the weather, and systematically eliminate their leadership and weapons crews. Without coordination, even the best defensive position becomes vulnerable." The plan required patience and exceptional marksmanship. Over the next 18 hours, Miguel's snipers established concealed positions at distances ranging from 750 to 920 yards from Hill 427. They worked in 2-man teams, with 1 shooter and 1 spotter per position. Then they waited for opportunities. At 13:22, the monsoon rain lightened temporarily, improving visibility from near zero to perhaps 60% of normal. Through his scope, Miguel identified a Japanese officer moving between bunker positions, coordinating defensive preparations. Range, 847 yards. Wind gusting 45 kilometers per hour. Temperature, 33 degrees. Humidity, 95%. He made his calculations, adjusted for the elevated target angle, and fired. The officer collapsed. Before the Japanese could react, Corporal Wu fired from his position 200 yards to Miguel's left, eliminating a machine gun team leader. Then Private Cruz fired, then Sergeant O'Brien. Over the next 8 minutes, the sniper section fired 23 shots, killing 19 Japanese personnel, including 3 officers, 5 machine gun crew members, and 4 mortar team leaders. The effect was devastating. Japanese defensive coordination collapsed. Units stopped communicating effectively. Weapons crews became hesitant to expose themselves. When the scout rifle companies launched their assault at 1500 hours, they encountered disorganized resistance that crumbled quickly. Hill 427 fell with minimal American casualties. Major Fletcher's after-action report described the engagement as a textbook example of how specialized capabilities could overcome prepared defenses. Word spread rapidly through X-Corps, and requests for scout sniper support increased dramatically. Miguel's section found themselves shuttling between units, providing precision fire support that conventional weapons couldn't deliver. At 07:15 on May 2nd, Miguel received unexpected orders to report to 6th Army headquarters in Manila. He arrived the following morning, uncertain what to expect. Instead of a single officer, he found himself in a conference room with a brigadier general, 2 colonels, and Captain Holloway from Subic Bay. Brigadier General Robert Chase was 47, a career artillery officer who'd commanded Philippine Department Logistics before the war and had escaped to Australia in early 1942. He'd spent 3 years studying why American forces had lost Bataan and what changes were needed to prevent similar failures. Sergeant Santos, I've been reviewing Captain Holloway's technical reports and Major Fletcher's combat assessments. Chase began without preamble. Your modification system has demonstrated measurable combat effectiveness in 47 separate engagements over the past 2 months. Scout units using modified weapons have achieved objectives faster and with lower casualties than comparable units using standard equipment. The data is conclusive. Thank you, sir, Miguel replied, uncertain where this was leading. However, the data also presents me with a significant problem. You've developed a system that violates regulations, uses unauthorized materials, and couldn't be formally approved by any procurement board in existence. Yet it works better than what we're currently issuing to troops. That creates an institutional dilemma. Colonel William Hart, the senior ordnance officer present, spoke up. Sir, the regulations exist for valid reasons. If we authorize one soldier to modify issued equipment using local materials, we open the door to chaos. Every unit will start improvising, creating maintenance nightmares and safety hazards. I understand your concerns, Colonel, Chase replied. But I've also read the casualty reports. Scout units with modified weapons are completing missions, with 30% fewer casualties than units using standard equipment in comparable terrain. How do I justify not adopting methods that save American lives? The debate continued for over an hour, touching on procurement regulations, liability concerns, training requirements, and supply chain complications. Miguel sat silently, realizing he was watching the same institutional forces that had nearly gotten him court-martialed on Bataan, now grappling with the reality that his illegal innovations actually worked. Finally, Chase made his decision. Here's what we're going to do. We will not formally authorize the Santos modifications. Regulations remain unchanged. However, we will also not prohibit individual soldiers from maintaining their weapons, using whatever methods they deem appropriate for local conditions. If scout units choose to organize training in tropical weapon maintenance using native materials, that's their prerogative as long as safety standards are maintained. It was the same bureaucratic compromise that had allowed the modifications to spread informally, now sanctioned at the Army level through carefully crafted ambiguity. Miguel could continue teaching his techniques. Units could continue adopting them, but the Army would maintain official deniability about violating its own regulations. Miguel returned to the Cagayan Valley campaign with renewed purpose, but also growing awareness that institutional recognition would never come. The meeting at 6th Army headquarters had made clear that while his innovations worked, they would remain forever in bureaucratic limbo, neither officially authorized nor officially prohibited. It was a compromise that allowed practical adoption while protecting the army from admitting its standard procedures had been inadequate. The campaign intensified through June and July 1945. Japanese forces under General Yamashita fought with desperate ferocity, knowing that every day they held out delayed the inevitable American advance toward Japan itself. The terrain favored defense, narrow mountain passes and heavily forested ridgelines, where prepared positions could hold up entire battalions. Miguel's sniper section operated continuously, providing precision fire support that conventional weapons couldn't match. At 07:30 on June 18th, the sniper section received orders to support the 32nd Infantry Division's assault on a Japanese strongpoint near Bambang. Intelligence estimated 300 defenders had fortified a hilltop position that commanded the only practical route through the mountains. Previous attacks had been repulsed with heavy casualties, and Division Commander Major General William Gill was desperate for alternatives to frontal assault. Miguel reconnoitered the position with Sergeant Patrick O'Brien, studying approaches and defensive arrangements through their scopes. "They've learned from previous engagements," O'Brien observed. "Notice how they're keeping key personnel under cover during daylight. They know about our long-range capabilities now." "Which means we need to change tactics," Miguel replied. "If they won't expose themselves during the day, we operate at dawn and dusk when visibility is marginal. Use the transition periods when they have to rotate guards and coordinate defensive positions." The strategy required patience and acceptance of limited engagement windows. For 3 days, the sniper section positioned themselves at extreme ranges, firing only during brief periods when Japanese personnel had to expose themselves. Miguel personally made 11 shots over those 3 days, eliminating an officer, 3 machine gun crew leaders, and 7 soldiers moving supplies between bunkers. The cumulative effect disrupted Japanese defensive coordination, allowing the 32nd Division to advance with minimal casualties. By late July, the character of the campaign was changing. Japanese resistance, while still fierce, was becoming increasingly disorganized as supply lines collapsed and communication networks were destroyed. Rumors circulated among American forces about a new weapon that might end the war quickly, though specifics remained classified. On August 6th, Miguel's section was operating near Tuguegarao when word spread through the regiment about an atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Few soldiers understood what atomic meant, but the implications were clear. Something fundamental had changed. 3 days later, a second bomb struck Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The announcement came at 14:45, crackling over field radios throughout the Cagayan Valley. Miguel was cleaning his rifle when Lieutenant Morrison gathered the company. "Effective immediately, all offensive operations are suspended. Japan has accepted unconditional surrender. The war is over." The reaction was subdued. After 3 years of continuous combat, most scouts were too exhausted for celebration. Miguel sat with his modified Springfield, thinking about the journey that had brought him from Bataan to this moment. How many lives had the modification saved? Hundreds, certainly, possibly thousands, when counting the ripple effects through units that had adopted the system. Yet officially, none of it had ever happened. The demobilization process began immediately. American forces started withdrawing from forward positions, consolidating near major bases for eventual transport home. The Philippine scouts faced an uncertain future. Rumors suggested the unit would be disbanded, now that the Philippines were preparing for independence, though nothing was official. At 09:15 on August 22nd, Miguel received orders to report to Subic Bay Naval Armory one final time. He arrived 3 days later, finding Captain Richard Holloway and Chief Petty Officer Frank Chen waiting with several technicians he didn't recognize. "Sergeant Santos, thank you for coming," Holloway began. "We're conducting final documentation of your modification system before the Armory transitions to peacetime operations. We need your rifle for archival preservation." Miguel had anticipated this, but still felt reluctance at surrendering the weapon that had kept him alive through 4 years of warfare. "What happens to it, sir?" "It will be stored in the Navy's Weapons Development Collection, properly catalogued, preserved for future study." Holloway paused. "The official record will list it as Springfield Modified, Origin Experimental Philippine Theater. Your name won't be attached. The Army has decided that acknowledging individual innovations would set problematic precedents." Chen looked frustrated by this decision. "Sir, Sergeant Santos deserves recognition for developing a system that saved American lives. Denying him credit isn't just unfair, it's historically dishonest." "I agree, Chief, but the decision came from above my authority level. The best I can do is ensure the weapon is preserved and the technical details documented. Someday, perhaps decades from now, historians will piece together what actually happened." Miguel handed over his rifle, watching as Chen carefully wrapped it for transport to the archives. 4 years of refinement, thousands of rounds fired, innovations born from desperation and traditional knowledge, all reduced to an anonymous entry in a storage facility. Over the following weeks, Miguel's sniper section was disbanded as the scouts prepared for demobilization. Corporal James Wu returned to Manila, hoping to rebuild his family's business destroyed during the occupation. Private Ramon Cruz planned to continue his education, using the GI Bill if Filipino veterans qualified. Sergeant Patrick O'Brien, after 24 years of service, faced mandatory retirement. At 08:30 on September 14, 1945, Miguel received his discharge papers at Fort McKinley. The document listed his service dates, ranks held, and campaigns participated in, but mentioned nothing about weapon innovations or the lives saved through technical ingenuity. Just another scout sergeant being released to civilian life. He returned to Manila, finding his family's armory destroyed during the Battle of Manila earlier that year. His father had died during the fighting, his mother had fled to relatives in the provinces, and the building itself was rubble. Miguel stood in the ruins, remembering the workshop where he'd learned the skills that would later save so many lives, and realized that this knowledge had no peacetime application. For several months, Miguel worked odd jobs while Manila slowly rebuilt. In February 1946, he secured employment as a gunsmith with a sporting goods company that catered to wealthy hunters. The work was familiar but unsatisfying, repairing shotguns and hunting rifles that would never face the challenges his modifications had been designed to overcome. Then came the devastating news. On February 18, 1946, the United States Congress passed the First Rescission Act, declaring that service by Philippine scouts and Filipino soldiers would not be considered active service for purposes of benefits under American law. In a single legislative act, 260,000 Filipino veterans were stripped of promised pensions, medical care, and educational benefits. Miguel learned of the law through a letter from the Veterans Administration denying his application for benefits under the GI Bill. "Your service with the Philippine Scouts does not qualify as active duty service for purposes of this program," the form letter explained. The betrayal was absolute. Filipino soldiers had fought alongside Americans, died in the same battles, endured the same hardships, yet would receive none of the benefits promised. In July 1946, the Philippine Scouts were officially disbanded as part of the Philippines' transition to independence. The unit that had served American interests for 45 years, that had been the first American forces engaged in World War II, that had endured Bataan and then rebuilt to fight throughout the Pacific, simply ceased to exist. A few American officers received reassignments. Filipino soldiers like Miguel received discharge certificates and nothing more. By 1948, Miguel had established a modest gunsmithing business in Quezon City. He rarely spoke about the war or the innovations he'd developed. When customers occasionally asked about his service, he deflected with vague answers. What was the point of explaining technical achievements that had been systematically erased from official records? In October 1948, his modified Springfield completed its journey through military bureaucracy. Naval weapons specialists at the testing facility in Maryland examined it one final time, documented its components, and filed a technical report that would remain classified for decades. The rifle was then transferred to long-term storage, catalogued simply as Item 4078B, Springfield 1903, Rifle, Modified Configuration, Philippine Theater Origin, Donor Unknown. The bamboo lattice system Miguel had developed through years of trial and error, the almaciga resin compound refined through hundreds of iterations, The copper thermal compensation sleeves fabricated from scavenged materials, all were photographed, measured, and filed away. Scientists noted in reports that the modification principles anticipated thermal management techniques that wouldn't be officially researched until the 1960s, but they never connected the innovation to a 28-year-old Filipino scout who'd started experimenting on Bataan in 1942. Miguel lived quietly for the next decades. He married in 1952, raised 3 children, and operated his gunsmithing business until retirement in 1978. He never applied for American veterans' benefits again after the 1946 rejection, though he remained active in Filipino veterans organizations that lobbied unsuccessfully for recognition and compensation. In the 1980s, military historians researching unconventional innovations during World War II began encountering references to modified Springfield rifles used by scout snipers in the Philippines. Reports mentioned exceptional accuracy under tropical conditions, engagement ranges that exceeded standard doctrine, and systematic modifications using local materials. But the trail always went cold because official records had been deliberately sanitized to avoid acknowledging regulation violations. In 1992, a researcher named Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Naval War College was studying Philippine scout operations when she discovered the Santos method mentioned in an obscure after-action report. Further investigation led her to the archived rifle at the Weapons Development Facility, now transferred to the National Museum of American History. She published a paper documenting the technical sophistication of the modifications and noting that they anticipated developments in materials science by decades. Miguel was 78 years old when Mitchell's research assistant finally located him in Quezon City in 1994. The interview was brief. Miguel, suffering from emphysema and largely confined to his home, was reluctant to discuss wartime experiences. "I did what needed doing," he said simply. "Used what my father taught me, combined it with what the jungle required. Nothing more complicated than that. But you saved hundreds of lives with your innovations," Mitchell's assistant pressed. "Don't you want recognition for that achievement?" Miguel considered the question for a long moment. The men who survived because their rifles didn't jam in monsoons, the officers who came home because Japanese snipers were neutralized at impossible ranges, they're the recognition. Official acknowledgement from institutions that stripped my benefits and erased my service, that means nothing. Miguel Santos died on March 3, 1997, at age 81. His obituary in the Manila Bulletin mentioned his scout service, but included no details about weapon modifications or innovations. His family donated his personal papers to the Philippine Veterans Museum, where they gathered dust in an understaffed archive. In 2016, 70 years after the first Rescission Act, the United States Congress finally granted congressional gold medals to Filipino veterans of World War II. The ceremony in Washington acknowledged the contributions of soldiers who'd been denied recognition for decades. But for Miguel and thousands like him, the recognition came far too late. Today, his rifle remains in the Smithsonian collection, displayed occasionally in exhibits about Pacific theater weapons. The placard identifies it as a modified Springfield from the Philippines, noting the innovative use of local materials to enhance tropical performance. But Miguel's name appears nowhere in the display, lost to the institutional amnesia that erased so many Filipino contributions to Allied victory. His story, like those of countless others, survives only in fragmentary records and fading memories, a testament to innovation born from necessity and courage, systematically forgotten by the institutions that benefited most from both.